Hi everyone, welcome back. Now, in this session, we're going to actually have some common sense discussion on pricing of forwards and futures relative to the underlying share price. But before we get into that, there are two statements that I would actually like to make. First one, let's say you actually have two cars in front of you. All right, both these cars, let's say, are having equal appeal to you in terms of they have the same seating space, they have the same brand, or they have the same brand value, they have the same finish, etc., etc. But there's just one thing which is different between car A and car B. Car A has got a higher mileage compared to car B. Now, what basically I'm trying to say is the car A will run more number of kilometers per liter of petrol versus car B. Now, which car are you actually going to pay a higher price for? Just give it a thought. Just maybe you can pause this video, give it a thought, frame an answer in your head, and then come back and resume the video. Obviously you're going to pay a higher price for car A, right? Because car A is better than car B, and obviously if both the cars cannot command the same price, the price of car A is going to be higher compared to the price of car B. For car B you will pay a lower price, and for car A you will actually pay a higher price relatively. That's point number one. Always remember that in the market, a good thing will always come at a cost. All right. So if car A has a good feature, the cost of car A is always going to be higher than the cost of car B. That's number one. Number two, in at least in this particular lecture, think of forwards and futures as upside betting, and do not get into the theoretical definition of forwards and futures wherein you are actually entering into an agreement to buy the underlying, etc., etc. Think of forwards and futures as an upside betting. Now, with this context, let's actually think of what's actually happening in forwards compared to shares. Now, in shares, when you buy a share, you're actually entering into a bet that the share price will actually go up, all right? Because you gain when the share price goes up, all right? So in shares, it's clear that you're actually entering into an upside betting. In forwards and futures also, like I discussed in lecture 1, when you're buying a forward, it is technically an upside betting, because if the share price at maturity is greater than the forward price, then you stand to gain. Otherwise, you stand to lose. Therefore, forward is also technically an upside betting. So if you think of it properly, both share and futures and forwards are doing the same thing. They are enabling you to enter into an upside betting. But there is a catch. In case of share, you are required to pay the entire amount of share price at t equal to 0. In the previous lecture, we were talking about, let's say, Infosys, whose share price was 1800. So if you want to enter into an upside bet using shares, then you actually have to pay the entire 1800 for entering into that upside betting. Whereas in futures, you don't have to pay anything today to enter into that upside bet. Alright, you just have to pay the margin, but if you forget the margining rules, you actually do not have to enter, you do not have to pay anything to enter into an upside betting. So if you think of it, futures is actually better than shares, because futures may you're able to enter into the same kind of transactions by not paying anything today, whereas in case of shares, you have to pay a massive sum of 1800 to actually enter into the transaction. Therefore, futures is actually better than forwards. Futures is better than shares. I'm so sorry. Futures and forwards are better than shares. Reason being, you do not have to borrow money to buy the share. If technically, if you think of it, to buy the share today, let's say you're starting on a clean slate, you don't have any money with you, you will actually have to borrow money from the market and then buy the share. In futures, you do not have to borrow money from the market. Even if you have 0 rupees with you, you can still enter into the contract ignoring the margining rules. Therefore, future is able to help you save borrowing cost. All right. In case of shares, you're actually going to incur the share price today and also the borrowing cost associated with it. Whereas in futures, it's able to actually save you the entire borrowing cost, because you do not actually have to borrow any money for the purpose of entering into futures. Therefore, point number one, futures is better than shares because you do not incur borrowing cost. Point number two, if you also think of it, let's say if you buy a share, you're actually going to receive dividend. In the case of TCS that we actually took in the previous lecture, TCS was going to give you a dividend at T equal to 4. If you buy a share, or if you are holding a share, then you are entitled to receive that dividend. Whereas if you are actually holding a forward contract, let us say I've bought the TCS forward contract or future contract, I am not entitled to that dividend at T equal to 4, because my forward contract is only maturing at T equal to 6. Therefore, I am not going to be entitled to the dividend that TCS is going to declare at T equal to 4. And therefore, in this sense, forwards and futures are inferior to shares, because in case of shares, I am having a potential future cash inflow, whereas in case of futures and forwards, I'm not having that cash inflow. So point number one was futures and forwards are able to help you save on borrowing costs. Reason being, for buying the share, you're actually supposed to borrow money from the market, and you're going to incur borrowing costs. Whereas for buying the forwards and futures, you do not have to incur that borrowing cost. So futures is better than shares. I don't know why I'm saying futures is better than forwards. I'm so sorry if in this video I've uttered anywhere saying futures is better than forwards. Then please consider it. My intention was futures is better than shares. All right. So futures is better than shares to the extent of borrowing costs saved, but futures is inferior to shares to the extent of dividends that are declared by the company, because a shareholder is entitled to dividend, whereas a future holder or a forward contract holder is not entitled to receive that dividend from the company. All right. Therefore, if you actually think of it, a futures price is going to be always higher than the forward futures price. Again, I said forward price. Futures price is always going to be higher than the share price if the company is not going to declare dividends. If the company is not declaring dividends, a futures price will always be higher than the share price, because the futures price is going because the future you like, just like how we had the car analogy where car one had a better feature and therefore price of car one was higher. Here future has a better feature, which is nothing but saving of borrowing costs, and therefore futures price is always going to be higher than the share price. But with the company which actually has dividend, then the futures price may be higher or lower than the share price. Reason being, futures price is futures is also inferior with regard to the dividends that are being declared by the company. So there is basically a fight that is going on between the savings and borrowing costs and the dividends that the company is actually declaring. And based on the movement, if the quantum of dividend is actually higher than the savings and borrowing cost, then the futures is actually going to be of lesser than the share price. I'm just repeating my last sentence. If the quantum of dividends is greater than the borrowing cost that you're able to save, then futures on a net basis is actually inferior. All right, it's inferior because the shareholder is going to receive much higher dividend than the borrowing cost that he's actually going to incur. And if the futures is inferior, then it's similar to the car analogy. Futures being inferior will command a lower price than the share price itself. All right. Therefore, futures price has a positive relationship with the level of risk-free rate. Reason being, risk-free rate is being taken as a proxy for the amount of borrowing cost that we actually incur. Risk-free rate is being taken as a proxy for the amount of borrowing cost that the shareholder actually incurs. Therefore, futures has a positive relationship with the risk-free interest rate, which means if the risk-free interest rate keeps going higher, then the borrowing cost that the shareholder is actually going to incur will keep going higher, which means the futures is much, much better than the share price. Already, the futures is much better than the share, right? Therefore, the futures will command a higher price compared to the share. Whereas in case if the whereas the futures price has a negative relationship with the quantum of dividend. If the quantum of dividend increases, then the future is relatively inferior to the share, and therefore the futures price will be lesser than the share price. That's the reason we're trying to say that the futures has a negative relationship with the level of dividends. Now this can be thought of in a common sense way, just like how you and I just saw, or it can also be thought of in the form of the equation. Sorry, let me just you can also think of it when you look at the equation. Now we determined that the price of the forward contract is S into 1 plus RF whole power T less future value of dividend. Now obviously if the risk-free interest rate over here goes up, if it clearly is showing you that the forward price will actually go up, right? As the risk-free interest rate goes up, your LHS, which is the forward price, will go up. Similarly, if the dividend goes up, your forward price will actually fall. And that's the reason you can also look at the equation and think of it that forward price is positively related to the level of interest rates, which is determined by the risk-free rate, and is negatively related with the quantum of dividend. As the dividend goes up, the forward price or the futures price will fall as it is becoming inferior relative to the share. All right. So this RF, this multiplying by 1 plus RF whole power T can be thought of as the borrowing cost that the shareholder is actually going to incur, and the future value of dividend can also be thought as the benefit that the shareholder is receiving, which the futures holder is actually not entitled to. All right. Summary of the discussion: nothing but futures is better than share price because in futures you do not incur borrowing cost. future is inferior to share price because you do not receive dividends in case of futures, but you receive dividends in case of shares. All right. Therefore, whichever is there's going to be a fight between the borrowing cost saved and the dividends received. Whichever is higher will determine whether the futures price is greater than the spot price or whether the futures price is less than the spot price. All right, this was a very short, commonsensical discussion that I actually wanted to share because I thought maybe the last lecture was too much of formula crunching. I just wanted to come down a little less to a lesser level and then just discuss informally with regard to why futures price is greater than or less than the share price. All right, in the next lecture, we'll actually continue by tweaking this formula to an alternative formula and then we'll go ahead with the remaining part of the series. All right, thank you guys. Bye.